So we're going to move on to the administration's presentation.
Should Matt come up on his own and then everybody else?
Yeah. And Mr. Almy, as you coming up to join us, I'm going to ask Secretary Rodriguez and Secretary Kelly, Secretary Laird, Executive Director Winston, along with Secretary Ross. A very heady panel. We're very impressed that you would join us today. Thank you. And we'll begin with you, Mr. Almy.
Thank you, Senator. Matt Almy, Department of Finance.
And as you begin, I'm sure you all have some prepared thoughts and comments, but if you could also potentially respond to some of the concerns and questions that you've just heard as we've made our way through around the committee panel.
Yes, thank you. Matt Almy, Department of Finance. The governor's budget proposes a $3.1 billion cap-and-trade expenditure plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through programs that support clean transportation, sustainable communities, energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, and waste diversion. The framework for prioritizing the cap-and-trade expenditure plan was informed by three primary considerations. First is the state's broader climate strategy. The governor's budget prioritizes investments to support the state's broader climate strategy, including requirements established in legislation and the governor's recent executive order establishing a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Key climate change strategies include increasing electricity derived from renewable sources to 50%, reducing petroleum use in cars and trucks by up to 50%, doubling the rate of energy efficiency savings in existing buildings and make heating fuels cleaner, reduce the release of short-lived climate pollutants, increase carbon sequestrations on farms, in rangelands, and in forests and wetlands. The proposed expenditures in the budget align with these climate strategies. Second is the investment plan itself. The budget proposal was informed by public comments received through 11 public meetings and workshops as part of the development of the cap-and-trade investment plan. For example, after listening to public comments received at the workshops encouraging greater local control, the budget proposes $100 million for a new transformational climate communities program to support local climate actions in the state's top 5% of disadvantaged communities. And third, focused on benefits to disadvantaged communities. At least 30% of the cap-and-trade expenditures are proposed to benefit disadvantaged communities. The legislature will have an opportunity to evaluate all of the specific components of the cap-and-trade expenditure plan over the next several months. As the legislature considers the administration's proposal, I would like to emphasize that the cap-and-trade plan should not be viewed as a listing of standalone, separate programs, but as a balanced portfolio of investments in a cohesive package of programs that is designed to achieve both immediate short-term emission reductions as well as long-term transformational changes necessary to reduce the ongoing risks of climate change. Before I turn the microphone over to Secretary Rodriguez, I'd like to briefly respond to a few of the issues raised by the LAO and some of the comments we received earlier from the earlier panel. First, the LAO analysis highlights some of the trade-offs associated with expending greenhouse gas reduction fund. Budget decisions, of course, are ultimately decisions about trade-offs. Although the LAO suggests that the cap sector investments, such as those in the transportation sector, may not be as cost-effective as those in the uncapped sectors, the administration supports approaching GHG Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund expenditures from a more holistic view that also includes a cost-benefit perspective. Consistent with the intent of AB 1532 to look at a broad range of co-benefits, a broader cost-benefit perspective recognizes that cap-and-trade programs that support reductions in petroleum use also achieve significant co-benefits, such as additional affordable housing, improved mobility as a result of increased transit and active transportation opportunities, and benefits to disadvantaged communities. These additional public benefits would not be reflected in the LAO's cost-effectiveness analysis. Second, the LAO analysis suggests that it's important to establish a general framework for cap-and-trade spending proposals. As I alluded to earlier, the governor's budget does have an established framework that prioritizes investments to support the state's broader climate strategy, including meeting the state's long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And lastly, the LAO recommends that the administration provide more information on the benefits of the proposal. Consistent with the requirements to provide an annual report on the outcomes of cap-and-trade programs, the administration does intend to be releasing the annual report in March, which will provide most of the information that the LAO is requesting. This information, which will be based on the most updated scientific methodologies, will help inform the legislature's review of the cap-and-trade package. There's been some discussion, I think, about kind of what the contents of the annual report will be. And so I'd like to give as kind of illustrative examples from last year's report of kind of the information that was provided last year on some of the outcomes from various programs. It is true, the LAO alluded to that because these were a lot of times new programs and we're just getting off the ground, that the report was just focused on those projects that had already been funded. So 3 illustrative examples. One is the Air Resources Board's Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. As of January of last year, there were over 30,000 rebates that resulted in annual emission reductions of 113,000, and estimated reductions over the life of the project would be 1.7 million. Another example is the Department of Food and Ag's SWEEP program. There were 84 grants in total that resulted in annual emission reductions of about 2,500, and over the life of that project would result in emission reductions of about 38,000. That's metric tons. And then the third example is CalRecycle's Organics grant program. There were 5 grants in total, 5 grants for a total of $14 million. Annual reductions from those grants were estimated at 165,000 for estimated total reductions over the life of the project was almost 1.7 million. And then in addition, the report identified the amount of expenditures and projects that were located in disadvantaged communities as well. So I wanted to give that as kind of an illustrative example from last year's report of the kind of information that can be expected. With that, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Secretary Rodriguez.
Mr. Secretary, before you begin your presentation, thank you, Mr. Almy, for yours. It's been brought to my attention that there may be some folks here today who are expecting some action of the committee today, specifically on AB 133 and AB 135. This is just an informational hearing. We'll not be taking any action on either of those bills today. Welcome, Secretary Rodriguez.
Well, thank you to the chair and the members of the committee. I understand, having sat through the previous portion of today's meeting, that you have a number of questions. So I'll try to be brief so that you have time to ask questions of the administration. I'll basically be touching on 2 parts of the cap-and-trade expenditure program that are housed directly within Cal EPA or boards or departments within Cal EPA. Specifically, $560 million would be going to the Air Resources Board, and then $100 million would be going to Cal Recycle. Just very, very briefly, in general, about $460 million of the money that would be going to the Air Resources Board will be going primarily to implement programs that the legislature has directed or approved in the past. So, for example, money will be diverted to implementation of AB 118, the Air Quality Improvement Program, which really started the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program. That is the incentives or vouchers that are provided for purchasers of zero-emission vehicles. consistent with SB 1275, which set up the Charge Ahead California initiative. Our goal in California is to have 1 million car ZEVs, zero-emission vehicles, on the roads in California by 2020. And, of course, the governor's goal is to have 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles on the roads in California by the year 2025. And so funding from the Cap and Trade program will go to funding those programs that will provide incentives for purchases of those cars. Additionally, we will be focusing on programs that will try and move those cars into disadvantaged communities and make sure that disadvantaged communities also have access to zero-emission vehicles and the benefits of these programs. That's one of the things that you can't really control purely through when you're dealing with a market, for example, and I know there's been some question about, so what do these cap and trade expenditures just sort of add generally to what we're getting through the cap and trade program? This expenditure of money will help us to focus some of the benefits of the cap and trade program and get reductions in areas and co-benefits in areas of the state that wouldn't otherwise be able to get those benefits by providing greater incentives, for example, in disadvantaged communities in California, or making sure that we're reaching out to lower income families in California to make sure that they have an opportunity to take advantage of some of these programs. Additionally, we will be looking at ARB to implement SB 1204, the hybrid and zero-emission truck and bus voucher program that was adopted through there. And again, this is a program that will provide vouchers in certain parts of the program, or trying a couple of new programs that will provide for purchase of zero-emission buses and trucks to try and get them out on the road, see what interest there is in promoting those vehicles. Additionally, we're looking at providing a program that will encourage zero-emission drayage equipment and vehicles, and particularly in our ports, in our freight hubs. The goal here, again, is to try and incentivize some change in the way you power your vehicles in transit and freight movement. And in particular, we think that this should help, again, disadvantaged communities or communities that are around our ports, that are around our freight hubs. Frankly, through these programs, ARB is hoping to have 50% of the funding benefit disadvantaged communities in California. Now, I'm sure the committee will recall that SB 535 requires that 25% of cap and trade funds benefit disadvantaged communities in California. The goal here is for this particular set of expenditures to have 50% of the expenditures benefit disadvantaged communities. And certainly we're very mindful of the fact that 10% at least has to be spent directly in disadvantaged communities. So the actual breakdown of where the money will go into these various programs that I've described will be spelled out in a plan that will be presented in May to the Air Resources Board. That will be the fiscal year 16-17 funding plan for low-carbon transportation investments and the Air Quality Improvement Program. But, of course, the board will wait to actually adopt a plan until June after the budget has been approved, so we know exactly what funds will be available. In addition to that spending, the Air Resources Board will devote another $60 million to an area that we don't get through directly through cap and trade, and that is the short-lived climate pollutants, which is another difficult area in California and an area that we want to focus on. That's black carbon, that's methane, that's hydrofluorocarbons. And the proposal right now is to spend $40 million actually to replace residential wood-burning devices to reduce black carbon. That would, we figure, get to about 15,000 to 30,000 such devices. Also provides us with an opportunity to make sure that some of the funding from the Cap and Trade program is getting to more rural parts of California. There's been concern that not all parts of California have been able to share in the funds that are available in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and so this is an effort to make sure that funding is getting to all parts of the state, while, of course, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and dealing with climate change. And then a further $20 million would go to reduce refrigerants in disadvantaged communities. Refrigerants are your hydrofluorocarbons. They are a greenhouse gas, a very potent greenhouse gas. And so what we're trying to do is to reach out to those areas where you're not seeing a transition in refrigerants and try and incentivize some improvements in refrigerants in those areas, in refrigeration in those areas. It will have the benefit of making those areas more energy efficient as well, and just help to bring them up to speed and help businesses in those communities. So that, in a nutshell, is how ARB would be proposing to spend the $560 million. I know that there's been a great deal of discussion here on, so how do you figure out the metrics in this? And I will just say, as an attorney aware of the fact that there's litigation concerning this program, one of the things that we've emphasized both within Cal EPA and to other programs that are receiving greenhouse gas reduction funds is that we need to prove up at the end of the day where our emissions are have been achieved. And, you know, there's a wide range of programs that are out there. Some of them are somewhat innovative, and so when you're dealing with farming practices, when you're dealing with forest management, you know, trying to really quantify the exact amount of greenhouse gas reductions we're going to get is something that requires a great deal of study. But in each of these programs, what we're doing is doing an estimate, but there will be a prove up at the end, and that's what you're going to be seeing in these reports, such as you'll see in March, so we can come back and quantify. This is where we receive the reductions, and that will inform then future, we think, spending plans. So that's just a general observation on how I see this process working. Let me talk a little bit about CalRecycle. CalRecycle has had some experience in spending $30 million so far between 2014 and this year. They will be reporting back on the emissions reductions that they've received through that expenditure so far. With this $100 million, we would look again to reduce some of the other sources of greenhouse gases that you might not normally get through some of these other programs. And in particular, what we're looking to do is reduce the amount of waste that goes to landfill so that you have less methane produced by those landfills. We're also looking at a grant program that would allow our anaerobic digesters to work more efficiently so that we can process more waste. And so from that process, you can get biofuels, you can get compost, you can get other things that then provide other co-benefits that can be used to provide alternate fuels or sequester carbon. And then additionally, we're just looking to reduce the expenditures on new plastics. If we can recycle plastics, that's been demonstrated to be something that will, recycling is less carbon intensive than just using new oil products. And so we're looking at what we can do to make sure that our recycling industry continues to be robust in a period of time when oil prices have been severely reduced. And so it's more competitive and more difficult in the recycling industry. So we'll be looking at that. That's how we would be proposing to use the funds that will be going to CalRecycle. With that, I will turn it over to Secretary Kelly.
Thank you, Secretary Rodriguez. Secretary Kelly, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I'm very pleased to be before the committee today to talk about the cap and trade program as it relates to the area of transportation. The transportation elements of the governor's cap and trade plan are similar with one notable exception to those presented and enacted last year. The continuous appropriated portion of the cap and trade investments are directed to our broad rail modernization program, our public transit capital and operating improvements that were originally authorized under SB 862 from 2014. This year, we are also proposing to supplement the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Grant Program by $400 million. The investment will allow us to expand transit grant programs, our transit grant program that awarded $225 million to 14 projects throughout the state last year. 13 of those projects, or 93%, provided direct, meaningful, and assured benefits to disadvantaged communities. With the expanded funding proposed in the governor's plan, the State Transportation Agency would be able to award more than $1 billion to transportation improvement projects throughout California by August of this year. We have already adopted guidelines for this program under the statutory process that requires us to, and applications for grant awards would be submitted to the agency by April, I think, 17th of this year. This particular investment is an important and vital part of meeting the requirements of legislation passed in 2015, SB 9 by Senator Bell. That bill required us to focus grants on larger and more transformative transit projects and to conduct a multi-year programming process for awarding those grants that I should say would take us well beyond 2020. So we are, I think I heard LAO say in their testimony and certainly in the analysis they've provided publicly, their written analysis of the program, that it's important the administration and the legislature are acting in unison to achieve shared objectives. If SB 9 is any indication of that, I think in the area of transportation investment, we're attempting to do so. The one new element in the transportation area of the cap and trade plan that is different and not seen before is a proposed $100 million low-carbon road program. This proposal was part of the governor's broader transportation funding plan, and it responded to requests from cities, counties, and other local entities that sought to utilize cap and trade funds for, quote, green neighborhood street improvements like complete streets, the installations of roundabouts, the optimization of traffic signals, or safety improvements for bicyclists and pedestrians that may encourage cleaner and healthier travel options. Projects must have quantifiable greenhouse gas reductions to be eligible for funding under the quantification methodology that's required by the Air Resources Board for that program, like all programs that we administer. The state has an important role to play in fulfilling a vision of our transportation system that can meet our collective mobility, safety, and sustainability objectives over the coming decades, and we think the cap and trade program enables us to fulfill that role. I just want to reiterate that I know Senator Pavley has stepped out, but she did raise the question about the funding for the Transit Intercity Rail Grant Program. Above one is the funding that's indicated under the continuous appropriation part, and then the supplemental amount. And again, I just want to reiterate that supplemental amount is so that we can meet the provisions of SB 9 to expand that program and achieve a multi-year programming exercise. We can only do that with additional revenue. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Secretary Kelly. Secretary Laird.
Thank you. Good morning. Given the questions you had and the fact that the hearing's taken a while, I'm going to collapse what I was going to say and hope to direct a couple of things to what the questions were. And in general, the governor set out in his State of the State a year ago just various directions that the climate policy should go for the state, and many of them were established paths, whether it was AB 32 and short-lived climate pollutants, or energy efficiency in buildings, or the renewable energy portfolio. But the one that sort of falls in the area of natural resources is the one that is a newer path. So we are, in many ways, establishing this for the first time compared to some of these more established paths. And when you look at the major pieces that fall in resources in what has been done in the last two budget cycles or what will be done, it really goes to sustainable agricultural lands, wetlands restoration, energy and water efficiency, and forest health and urban forestry. And let me sort of just focus on one a little bit here. Let me talk about the forestry issue because it covers a lot of the questions that were raised. And I think one of the things that's always difficult with natural resources is you capture the emissions and you deal with where the resources are. and that might not be in heavily urbanized areas. However, urban forestry really helps us deal with that, and cooling islands. And so we discovered that the urban forestry grants in the last cycle were so popular that there were requests that were 6 times more than what was available to do it, and close to 40,000 trees will be planted in or near disadvantaged communities throughout the state. That involves the local conservation corps, schools, and other organizations, but it deals with cooling urban heat islands and protecting school kids from the sun. So that is the one piece of it that does generally go to urban areas. But with the forest health, it is really envisioned as a broader policy. And there are temptations to go entirely with one piece of it. And for example, if the parts of this includes trying to deal with tree mortality and the millions of trees that are dying in the Sierra, whether or not that ties into the biomass industry, whether there's fuels prevention or fire prevention. So they are all pieces of a broader program, and the Rim Fire, which happened in 2013, released an estimated 11 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. This is equivalent to the annual greenhouse gas emissions from 2.3 million cars in California. And you wouldn't necessarily get at that if you had totally a program that was dealing with forest easement. So how do you do this in a broader way that you get at the different pieces of what you have to do? And I think that the problem is that, and Senator Pan has stepped out, but he asked about evaluation. And so how do you evaluate pieces of this to genuinely look as to whether they're achieving your goals? And while the LAO said, oh, it's the governor and the legislature, ARB's staff plays a very important role in really assuring that there's some methodology that assesses the greenhouse gas emissions in a way that you can measure against it. And when Senator Pan was talking about setting up evaluation, and usually you know beforehand, and being concerned about the word estimate, well, that's what setting up the evaluation is. You're doing an estimate, and then once you experience it and you do it, you're able to measure whether the estimate was on target in any way. And so that, and if you look at just the difficulty we've had sort of starting out with some of the forest programs, we were designing the programs within the guidelines to best integrate available greenhouse gas accounting standards and look at projects that then capture greenhouse gases and deals with the savings you have to do. And so with forestry, we had a very difficult time proving out the greenhouse gas savings, because initially on the first projects, there was a desire that we evaluate them on a one-by-one basis. And that is a very difficult thing to do when you're looking at the broader stand. So the question is can we in fact, and we're moving toward evaluating them on a landscape level, so that then you can look at the different pieces of it that realize the values that you are seeking and that are estimated in this, so that if you incorporate fire safety and emissions along with other issues such as dead and dying trees, that if they are left to rot, create additional emissions. You can look at this on a landscape level and sort of look at it together and not in the pieces, and try to assess in a good way how a broader program will actually allow you to capture greenhouse gas emissions and measure it. So that is our challenge in doing this. It's not that it's necessarily been done before. It has to be done at a broader level. I think Senator Pan heard that I mentioned his name, so he's run back in the hearing room. I will expect the appropriate rebuttal at the right time. But that's just sort of our challenge in doing this, and we really want to continue to work with stakeholders. And I think you see, you want to also interface with broader programs that we're doing in forests that might not be part of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have, which I know Senator Nielsen would be intimately familiar with, and other members that might have heavily forested lands. The Federal Forest Service has a different policy than the state in some ways on fire and how things go.